So have you recently bought a property from someone who recently passed away before the transfer process was actually effected? Now, if you are that person, you probably want to listen to this video. My name is Yolanda Mnyengeza, and I'm an attorney and a director at Mnyengeza Attorneys. So what are we talking about today? Now, today I want us to talk about what happens when the seller passes away before the property is transferred to the buyer's name. So, one of the things you have to note is that if a seller passes away before a transfer has been effected, the whole process, the transfer process, has to come to a stop. It has to be halted. Whether or not the documents have been lodged with the deeds office is irrelevant. The whole process has to come to a stand. So, what does this mean? Does this mean that the whole sale is now invalid? And if so, what is going to happen? Or what's the process now since the seller has passed away? So, first things first, the reason why the sale is actually halted. Let me take you back to when you were actually concluding the sale itself. You would have noted that during that time, you needed to sign documents as a buyer, and the seller also needed to sign his or her own documents. Now, when the seller was signing documents, there's a particular document that they needed to sign, which is referred to as the power of attorney. Now, that particular power of attorney was signed in favor of the conveyancer. So it was giving the conveyancer the authority to effect the transfer or to lodge the transfer process. So now that the seller has passed away, that instruction or that power of attorney is no longer valid, which means someone else has to now step in and actually give the conveyancer authority to effect this particular transfer. And this actually means that now everything, unfortunately, has to come to a stop. Does this mean that the sale is no longer valid? Not necessarily. See, if the sale was concluded in terms of the law and it met the requirements of a sale of an immovable property, the sale will remain intact. However, now the process is going to change altogether because this is no longer a sale of a property of someone who is still alive. This person is now a deceased person, which means someone else has to handle their affairs. Who is this person? The person we're referring to is referred to as an executor. Now, the executor is the person that takes over the administration process once a deceased has passed away. So what's the process going to look like now? So since the person has passed away or the seller has passed away, number one, a new instruction has to be given, like I mentioned. And number two, in order for this to happen, there has to be an authority given by the master. But how do we get to that how do we get to that particular point? So first things first, when the seller passes away, the seller's estate has to be reported. Now, in that process, then the executor has to ascertain whether the sale in actual fact is valid and is binding. Number two, the executor has to establish whether the estate of the deceased is solvent or insolvent. Why is this even necessary? What point is it to this particular process? Now, the reason why an executor has to ascertain whether the whole estate is solvent or insolvent is because once an estate is referred to as an insolvent estate, it is handled totally different. For instance, if there's debts of different creditors, there's preference on how those people are paid and what needs to happen to all of the property. And so if the estate is insolvent, it's going to be a much more harder process and it might hit you as the buyer. However, if the estate is solvent, then the process is going to occur as per normal, which means that what needs to happen is that the executor just needs to report the estate with the master and show in terms of documents that in actual fact this estate is solvent. So now that the estate has been reported, the executor has been appointed, the next step now is that the executor has to sign the power of attorney that is going to give favor to the conveyancer to effect the transfer into your name as the buyer. However, this particular power of attorney has to go through the master, because they also have to assess if there are any objections to make sure that the sale is in accordance. So once the master of the High Court has given the go-ahead, then the executor and the conveyancer can lodge and move ahead with the transfer of the property. So listening from this, you might actually think that the process is going to be much easier, or it's much easier. But unfortunately, the process is going to be a bit delayed, because the master also has to have its time to verify the documents and appoint their executor, and also verify and endorse this particular power of attorney. So you can expect a bit of delays in this regard. But if in actual fact the estate is solvent and there are no objections and the sale was valid, you can rest assured at least that in actual fact the sale can continue if dealt with in accordance and efficiently so. Now, normally in cases where a deceased estate or a property is sold out of a deceased estate, you would need, for instance, the consent of the heirs. But because this particular sale now takes place prior to the deceased passing away, this particular consent is no longer required. So then there is nothing that's going to delay in that regard, because at least you and the seller concluded this particular agreement prior to him or her passing away. So it may be alarming the fact that in actual fact this whole process has to come to a stop. But let me just say, you need not to worry. If in actual fact this immovable property was sold in accordance with the law and the sale is actually in accordance with the law, you can rest assured that the sale remains valid and transfer is going to take effect, and you have a right to that particular property as per the agreement that you signed with the deceased. It's just that in this particular instance, the whole process is going to take a bit of time. So do not be alarmed when there is actual delays in this process. I hope this information was useful, and that is going to be useful for you in the future in case you're not in this position. My name is Yolanda Nyengeza, and I'm an attorney and a director at Nyengeza Attorneys. Let's talk next time when we have something to talk about within the legal sector, or something you should probably know.